Could the scale of destruction and death in Derna have been prevented? While Storm Daniel brought catastrophic flooding, experts say years of neglect and corruption made things worse. Can Libya prepare for future disasters after years of political infighting between rival governments? I'm Hazem Sika, and today's newsmaker is the Derna disaster. Crumbling infrastructure, corruption, and the accelerating climate crisis. Experts say this lethal mix of factors triggered the tsunami that engulfed whole neighborhoods of the eastern Libyan city of Derna. With almost 4,000 people confirmed dead and more than 11,000 still missing, officials have denied their warnings were inadequate. But despite this, they had no evacuation plans. And more than a week after the disaster, demonstrators gathered outside Derna's Grand Mosque, accusing officials of neglect. So what is to blame for Africa's deadliest flood? And can Libya's rival governments put aside their differences for rescue and reconstruction efforts? Take a look.
Volunteers, food parcels and clothes have poured into flood-stricken Derna. All have come from across Libya. Despite years of conflict between the country's bitterly divided leaders.
This catastrophe proved that Libyans are united. Even those who have opposing political stance and views, or have different external or internal interests, were united after what happened in the east. In Derna, Al-Baida, Susha and Shahat, it proved that Libyans are united.
Thousands of people were killed in Derna last Sunday, when a tsunami-like wall of water washed away whole districts after 2 dams collapsed under storm floods. More than a week on, the death toll is still rising. The staggering scale of devastation has some asking if the disaster could have been avoided. UN experts have blamed climate factors and the legacy of Libya's war, depleting infrastructure, early warning systems, and emergency response.
This is a tragedy in which climate and capacity has collided to cause this terrible, terrible tragedy. Derna, a city of, over 100,000 people, 900,000 people affected, and this is on top of a situation in Libya where 300,000 people in Libya already needed humanitarian aid.
The dams that burst were built in the mid-70s to protect the 100,000 population of Derna after it was hit by flooding in the mid-20th century. Cracks in the walls were first reported in 1998, and the banks of a dry riverbed or wadi running through the city center had been heavily built on. That riverbed would become an epicenter of Derna's destruction. Libya's Prosecutor General says it will investigate the collapse of the dams as well as the allocation of maintenance funds.
The investigation includes the maintenance funds that were paid to maintain the 2 dams and to minimize the effects of their damage resulting from floods and heavy rainfall. This investigation is underway in the Public Prosecutor's Office. What we can say now is that the investigation will include local authorities as well as consecutive governments for negligence.
And despite Libyans coming together to help, observers are watching to see if Libya's rival governments can coordinate relief efforts. Derna is in eastern Libya, controlled by Khalifa Haftar, who mounted a 14-month campaign to capture the capital Tripoli from the UN-backed central government in 2019. Despite a 2020 ceasefire that ended most major warfare, a political gridlock has gripped Libya for more than a year, making national elections impossible. Since the Derna disaster, the rival administrations have tentatively coordinated on some issues, and foreign governments suspicious of Haftar and Libyan corruption have sent aid and volunteers. But analysts stress the shared national grief over Derna won't lead to a diplomatic breakthrough, and warn that political leaders could position themselves to benefit from any long-term development funds.
So what more could have been done in Derna? Well, let's bring in our guests to talk more about that. Joining me now from Istanbul is Anas Gomati. He is the director of the Sadeq Institute, a Libya-based think tank. Salah Aboulgasem joins us from Birmingham in the UK. He is the deputy director of Partner Development at Islamic Relief UK. And completing our panel is Ashok Swain from Uppsala in Sweden, a professor of peace and conflict research at Uppsala University. Good to have you all with us, gentlemen. So, Anas, let me start with you. Was this a man-made or natural disaster?
Well, it was certainly a man-made tragedy in the making. I mean, these were not just rainfall coming from the sky. These were two dams that burst. They were failed, at the very least, by the authorities there, who failed to monitor the rain flow. It was slowly going up into those dams for hours before. And when they burst and detonated a force akin to an atomic bomb going off in the city, we've seen the results. But that is the short and simple answer. This is not theology and it's not an act of God. It was a man-made tragedy.
We'll certainly talk more about that in a moment, but I want to get Ashok's take on this. How much is this down to a failure of government and political divisions in Libya, do you think?
I think, as was been told, that it is a man-made, completely man-made disaster. These dams were built from 1970s. These dams were not been repaired for the last 20 years. Despite there are lots of information that these dams will not last if this sort of disaster will take place. So this is because the ongoing conflict in Libya, which is going on since 2011. It's a country which has been extremely rich, oil rich, but it has not able to, due to conflicts, due to change of regime, and the ongoing violence, this has been happening. And what happened when this, storm Daniel came up? That is the time. This is not only Libya which has been affected. There are other countries nearby. Even Turkey got some water. Greece had also been affected. But this kind of situation, when it came in, I mean, this is not that the flood doesn't kill people, because flood could be easily told to people that this is coming. And so they didn't really do it. And the kind of information was told to the people was very sketchy, contradictory. And so they have completely failed in that sense how to really, in the beginning, how to rescue, do the rescue people and also give them the pre-warning.
Salah Aboulgasem, this has been a disaster of catastrophic proportions. And we mentioned some of the statistics at the top of the show there, the number of people who've died, the number of people who are still missing, the amount of damage and so on. But none of this can really quantify the unimaginable human impact that this has wrought. I know you've been involved in getting relief aid to those areas from the UK. Talk to us a little bit about that and how that's progressing, and what is the greatest need for people there right now?
Yeah, I mean, there are multiple needs. There isn't a greatest need per se, if you like. I mean, we all are very aware of what's happened, the depth and detail, and the time for accountability and a process of accountability must take place. And it's so important that happens to give really many lessons that can be learned, and also to really allow for the healing process, which in all honesty could probably never be completed, but for at least a process to take place. What we need to appreciate and understand is a humanitarian crisis has taken place. One message that we're really keen on giving now is that we have to prevent a second and a third humanitarian crisis. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is thousands of people have died. And now we've got a major risk of waterborne diseases. So you ask about what the major sort of need now, multiple needs. One of them is we need to prevent the waterborne diseases. How do we prevent that? We need to allow the agencies to have access. We need to allow those with the speciality and with know-how in order to coordinate, in order to work in such difficult contexts. We need to ensure that relief aid is given to the people. We need to ensure that people are not left hungry, people are not left homeless. We also need to be committed to understand that, yes, there is current media attention and interest in it, but Libya is a fragile state. There are so many things at play. We need to understand that context, and we also need to appreciate this is a long-term problem that requires a long-term solution. And from a pure humanitarian perspective, we need to understand that the human impact. We're hearing, and I'm hearing directly from our colleagues on the ground, of the psychological and emotional impact that this is, going to be having in the long term. There's a generation of children who've just witnessed what they're referring to in Arabic is it's like Yom al-Qiyamah, like the Day of Judgment, like Doomsday thing. Scenes, horrific scenes, families, full blocks where maybe I know a friend who lost 60 family members. You can't recover from this, and we're never going to be able to recover from this. But we need to understand that in the long term, how do we try to not only rebuild, go through a process of accountability, rebuild structures, rebuild homes, but also try and at least rebuild people's lives, people's livelihoods, people's emotions, people's psychological pain and suffering. And also we need to put in place measures to ensure something like this tragedy never happens again. And appeal to the international community to intervene now, to ensure that we're committed in the long term to putting the measures in place to avoid such issues happening again.
Well, you bring up a good point there about the international community, and we'll get to that in a moment. But I want to ask Gomati this question, and I don't mean to diminish or oversimplify the divisions in Libya right now between the political factions and the governments there. But in the short term, can this be seen as a wake-up call for those political factions, that they have to come together now to address the deep problems there right now?
No, I think within that actually is the illusion that it's somehow their disunity that needs to be resolved. They're unified in blocking elections, and they have been unified in blocking elections for the last decade. In fact, protesters last night in eastern Libya were screaming at the top of their lungs in Derna. The survivors of this calamity and this catastrophe were screaming at the top of their lungs for the parliament that has suffocated democracy now for the last decade, has shielded Khalifa Haftar and appointed him in 2015, the very same person who presided over the first war crimes that took place there in 2018, when he, in his own words, choked the city for a period of around a year. This is the kind of rallying call for Libyans. This isn't the time for Libyans to be calling kumbaya. They have never been divided. It's their political leadership that created this illusion of disunity. And they're using it now as a smokescreen to kind of suffocate the voices that are calling for accountability, and they're calling for a full investigation by local and international authorities, because we should be quite clear here. A rainfall warning is not the same as a dam burst warning. And when they locked those people into their homes in the hours that mattered on September the 10th, they essentially locked them into their homes, and it was a death sentence. They could have evacuated those citizens, they could have gotten them out. And right now, the sentence has been extended because they have been in charge of the logistical response for what has been happening over the last week. And when minutes matter in a humanitarian operation like this, they forced the landing of international aid and international rescue teams to Benghazi, the nerve center of their operations, 6.5 hours drive from Derna, when they could have been landing in Labrak an hour and 15 minutes away from this. So it's not just oversight, it's misdirection. They're trying to make sure that the voices in Benghazi and the voices in Derna are being shuttled away. We've heard about dissenting voices that have been silenced in the last few days. So much of what happened in the run-up to this catastrophe is so much about what Salah ad-Din and your other guests have been mentioning around the tragic kind of governance crisis that Libya has been enduring for the last decade, none of which are of a Libyan making, by the way. This is of the making of the international community because they appointed them.
Okay, just expand on that. To what extent is the international community responsible for this, and what should they be doing now?
Khalifa Haftar is a individual that is wanted for war crimes and under investigation for that in the ICC. He was tried in a civilian court last year in Virginia and found guilty of those same charges. Why is this individual shaking hands with
this
the
is
UN
the man, just to be clear, this Khalifa Haftar is the man who currently leads the government in eastern Libya, or the de facto leader there.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is an individual that is wanted for those crimes. His son, Saddam Haftar, who is in charge of the operation, and has just been given a $2 billion windfall for the quote-unquote relief and reconstruction of Derna, is now sent his brother to Brussels, who was there in the European Parliament yesterday, going around and saying that they have presidential ambitions and they have a new political project. So they're turning the lemons of Derna into their own lemonade. I mean, it's disgusting and vile. They've also blocked journalists in Benghazi trying to reach the Derna. They are now evacuating journalists so that Derna can be kept in the shadows. They block journalists from going to that protest that I spoke about a few moments ago. They block journalists from reporting on there, and you won't find a single journalist that can give you real film footage from that last night, so that they can suffocate the voices and misdirect them. But when that city goes back into the dark, we know what will happen to dissenting voices in the shadows. That is the danger of allowing the individuals that were criminally negligent at the helm of Derna for the days and hours preceding this disaster, that have been at the helm of this sinking ship in the last few days and the last week. What happens when the international community leaves, or at least the media leaves, when they can't speak to the media about what is happening on the ground there? What happens when they misdirect a lot of the aid money that has gone in, or they misdirect $2 billion of Libyan money and take it into their own pockets? It's a travesty.
Ashok Swain, what's your take on this and the role that the international community has played here?
I think, as I mentioned before, and all the speakers here mentioned there, that the international community, when it came into Libya in 2011, it replaced the regime with the force. And after that, it has really given up. And it hasn't really taken the responsibility that when you change a regime, you must have the responsibility of giving those, that you do responsible for the kind of mess you have created there. What happened here, as we see, that the rescue has not been there. In the relief measures, the international community is playing a little bit part, but because the kind of mess they have created, the kind of political vacuum they have created, the kind of conflicts they have been directly engaged in, the kind of ways the international or the Libya has been divided into different camps, particularly now in 2 divisions. And that's what is not working, because you can't really, even the 11,000 people are killed, 10,000 missing, 46,000 are displaced. You don't have a system which is so close to Europe that the international community's presence is extremely minimal and not able to do the relief operations well. If we were not able to do the relief operation well, how do you think that the resettlement process will be? So I think it is the international community must take this responsibility. It should be an eye-opener, which unfortunately doesn't take place, but I think they need to realize that if you keep on changing the regime with the force, you have the responsibility for these countries and those people. And that's what they have failed miserably in Libya. That's why we see this huge number of death, devastation and destruction, which has been not because of, as you had said, is not because of the God or not because of any kind of natural disaster. It's a terrible man-made disaster brought by the international community here.
Salah Aboulgasem, I want to ask you about some of the logistical challenges that your organization may be facing here in terms of getting the aid supplies to those areas, getting them to the transit points once they arrive there and getting it into the communities. Have you? I mean, some of this was talked about earlier. Have you heard stories like that there is a sort of bottleneck and some of this aid is not getting to people who really need it right now?
When there is a system, when there are institutions, when there is a process, the devastation in disasters as such will be huge. But when these things are in place, it allows access, it allows the ability for humanitarian aid to be received, and at least people to receive it in a certain manner. In the Libyan context, it's been extremely challenging. It's extremely risky. It's extremely difficult. We have, we have know-how, we have experience in working in conflict zones, and this one is very different. It's very unclear. The number, you base your needs assessment on numbers, on information. The information flow has been, it's unprecedented. We're unable at this stage to know the death toll. I don't think there is a confirmed concrete number on what the death toll is. We're unable to know exactly how many IDPs there are. We're unable to know exactly how many buildings have been affected. The logistics have been very challenging. I mean, as it's been well documented, and NS rightly says, logistically for us, even we've had at times have to fly some of our items into Tripoli and then take a treacherous long journey, over 1,000 kilometers to Darna. It's extremely challenging. It's
Sure,
extremely
and
difficult.
sorry to interrupt, is part of that because you don't know who you're dealing with once people get down there? They don't know who's in charge. They don't know how it's being coordinated among the different government levels.
I mean, it's not something that's happened overnight. There is an absence of any clear governing authority. There's an absence of any coordinating body. There's an absence of experience in how to deal. Look, and nobody can deal with an emergency on this scale. Let's be clear. But at least having some processes in place, having some coordinating authority, day by day, things are changing. The messages are changing. It poses many, many challenges. God bless the people of Libya. On a daily basis, the local aid from local communities surrounding villages and towns that have come on convoys, it's become more of a challenge. We know, I mean, I've seen it in many disaster zones. People's hearts go out when they hear they want to go and help their fellow Libyan. They're united in that front, but, not controlling that or managing that, providing aid that may not necessarily be needed, is specialism that's needed. Look, your footage is showing it. The first call we were giving is give us generators. We need electricity. We need to work through the night as the days become shorter in order to continue. It's those, and Enes says it rightly, it's minutes that make major differences in these sort of crises, in the sense that we need to work quickly, we need to have minimal obstacles, we need to get on with the job. We've been unable to do so for an absence of resource, for an absence of coordination, for an absence of clarity, and for major risk that's taking place. We want to bring in specialists. There isn't a clear process at the moment in order to bring in certain specialists, who has permission, who doesn't, and the supply chain is challenging. There are many different challenges, but we as an agency, like other agencies, we adapt, we work as hard as we can. I think it's important to also mention here that the people of Libya are qualified, capable people. Yes, there may be institutional gaps, but the people have the goodwill, have the willingness. They need to be empowered. They need to be given, that empowerment, that responsibility. Sure. One thing that we're keen on is building that local capacity. Is some of the programming that we've done previously, and it's something we believe in. The capability is there. They just need to be given the space and the ability to be able to do it, and that's been part of the challenge.
Okay, Ashok Swain, do you see any kind of glimmers of hope here? I mean, we've kind of painted a pretty grim picture up to this point, but do you think there is a capacity for things to change for the better as a result of something like this?
There are a couple of things which we can draw. At least there is a possibility that the international community must realize, and whatever the international community is left to see, that it will not be engaged in this kind of things in the future. But usually this kind of situation comes in when this so-called natural disaster or disaster takes place, kills many people, then we think that it might bring peace. Particularly the two conflicting parties here, the eastern side and the Tripoli, there has been some, despite all these kind of things, there are some cooperation to some extent. There have been some possibility of at least communication, the talk, which is going on. And there is so usually this kind of assumption takes place that this will lead to certain kind of peace. We have seen in some places these sort of interactions might lead to peace, but in some cases it doesn't. And in most of cases it doesn't. The reason why it doesn't is because that is a possibility. The problem is that the leadership in both sides really need to do this, and the international community and the people, those who are really interested in these issues, how they will facilitate it. And that's to be seen here, that has not taken place. So I think it's just anyone's guess that where it will lead to. But my hunch is that is very least likely that it will lead to probably kind of peace and cooperation that we are hoping for.
Let's give the last word to Anas on this. Do you see any glimmers of hope here at all?
I think the demands from people across Libya last night were like a pulse that shook the nation. I think you can feel it reverberating, and that rhythm is being felt now in Tripoli and in Benghazi and in Misrata, the main key cities on the northern coast, perhaps even in the southern of Libya where we don't have full access today. But ultimately, that rhythm is the trembles of authoritarians and unaccountable leaders. And we heard it last night the people of Derna and across the country want the overthrow of the parliament that has suffocated democracy across the country, that forced upon them a negligent and nepotistic ruler, the nephew of the chief of the parliament, Agela Salah, and they want accountability. Whether or not they get there is not about an optimistic note, it's a realistic note. Is the international community going to shirk its responsibilities? Are they going to allow a humanitarian intervention to become a staged military parade for the Libyan National Army? Are they going to allow for the cameras to go off and the city to go back into the darkness? Because that's what's happening now in Derna. It's what's happening in Benghazi. And so the next few hours and the next few days are going to be critical to this. If journalists leave, we always know that in the dark, there are those that play in the shadows, and the LNA is a chief culprit in this. The Libyan parliament is a chief culprit in this. But all of Libya's political authorities, East and West, have been in power now for too long. So on an optimistic note, I hope they're done. They should be stepping aside in that operation and allowing the international community to do its job in the best way possible. And individuals and institutions like Salah's, when those are on the ground, the brave ones that have risked their lives, they should be really leading the charge, not an authoritarian regime that is using this for staged PR.
All right, on that note, we'll have to leave it. Thanks very much to all three of you for being on The Newsmakers. And thanks for watching. You can follow us on X and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Hazem Sika. See you next time.